If someone carries holy meat in the fold of his garment and touches with his fold bread or stew or wine or oil or any kind of food, does it become holy? And the priest answered and said, no. So if I carry holy meat, right, and I put it into the pocket of my jacket, and then my jacket accidentally touches bread or stew or wine or oil or any other food, then does that become holy just because my jacket accidentally touched it? No, right? If someone who is unclean by contact with a dead body touches any of these, does it become unclean? And the priest answered and said, it does become unclean, yes. So on the flip side, if someone who has COVID, if they go out and they make contact with someone who is clean and healthy, will they infect them and make them unclean? Yes, absolutely. But why does God care so much about being clean and unclean? I mean, God doesn't get sick and he can't get ill, yet he always talks about being pure. It's because it has to do with the holiness of God, his purity, his perfection. And if something is unclean or sick, hey, it leads to death. And death is not just a natural part of life, it's God's judgment against sin. It's the fruit of sin. Let's look at what it says in Romans 6:23. The wages of sin is death. Then desire, when it has conceived, gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is fully grown, brings forth death. You see, his perfect holiness cannot come into contact with what is opposite of his holy nature. If we want to come before God, we too must be clean. We must be clean spiritually. And that's why it's important for us to be careful of what we watch, what we listen to, what we read, what we say, how we act. Because if we come into contact with any of these unclean things, we're not the one that's going to make those unclean things to be clean. It's going to be those unclean things that's going to make us to be unclean. It will taint us. It will taint our thoughts, our attitudes, our minds, our views, our values, etc. I mean, most of us are parents here, right? And even if you aren't, I'm pretty sure you have children in your life in some way, right? Whether it's a niece or nephews, or even if it's your friends' kids. And you can all agree that we must be careful to teach our children the right way. I mean, isn't this why we're constantly teaching our children right from wrong and doing our best to shield them from what they are exposed to, right? I mean, even the secular world has systems in place to make sure that certain content is age appropriate. And if this secular world sees the importance of these filters, then how much more important is it for us Christians to be guarding our children so that they are not exposed to these things that are unclean? And because we are all born sinners, we're all easily prone to wander and fall into the path of being unclean. That's why we need to watch ourselves and what we come into contact with, because that is what we are feeding our spiritual bodies. You see, back then, a leper was considered unclean, and some even thought that they were cursed by God for their sins. And he comes straight up and kneels before Jesus. Now, the original Greek word used here for the word knelt is proskuneo, which also happens to be the same word used for worship. So basically, it is a worshiping posture. So the leper came to Jesus and knelt down before him in a posture of worship. And he says in verse 2, Lord, if you will, you can make me clean. And Jesus stretched out his hand and touched him, saying, I will be clean. And Jesus stretched out his holy hand and touched him. I mean, this goes against everything what we just read in Haggai about how something clean cannot make something unclean to be clean when touched. What? And also, there's another what moment. Jesus didn't even have to touch the leper. He could have just spoken the words, be healed. and the leper would have been clean. It was so that it can be a revelation of who Jesus is and his glorious power. His leprosy did not make Jesus unclean, in that Jesus' cleanness, his holiness overpowered this man, and Jesus' purity came into contact with this man and made him clean. And church, that's what happens to all of us who come to Jesus in faith. He will cleanse us from our iniquities, and he will cleanse us from our sins. Because he took our uncleanness, our sins, our guilt, our shame, our pain, our sorrows, our shortcomings, and he took it upon himself, and he took it to the cross. And he gave us his righteousness, his holiness, his life, everything.